Hey everybody, it's Steven from Asian Boss. By now, many of us would like to believe that we've finally turned the corner on the pandemic and that the world is starting to return to normal. Is that true though? What's the latest on the COVID vaccine and how's the vaccination actually progressing on a global scale? To find out, we're gonna have a chat with Dr. Jerome Kim, the head of International Vaccine Institute and one of the leading vaccine experts in the world. We haven't caught up with him in a while, so let's go ask him some questions you want answered. I think you just need no introduction at this point. Just one of the foremost authority figures when it comes to vaccines in the world. You've been studying infectious disease and researching vaccines for the past 30 years. You served in the US military. Am I missing anything?
No, that's it.
And so I think people are getting the sense that things are improving gradually, but at the same time, we just don't have a clear sense of what the progress is. Just based on your data and numbers, like what percentage of the world right now has been vaccinated?
So they've given out about 1 billion doses of vaccine.
Right.
So that will give you an estimate of the total number. I mean, assuming that every vaccination is 2 doses. So, 500 million people out of 8 billion. So not enough. Actually, probably slightly more than 500 million because a number of countries are still, they report the number of jabs given. They don't necessarily say that everyone's gotten 2 doses. So in many countries, for instance in Korea, a lot more people have gotten a single dose than have gotten 2 doses.
Right.
And many countries are like that right now. They're spacing the doses out in order to vaccinate as many people as possible, as quickly as possible.
In the States, how many people have been vaccinated?
They're running around 45 to 50%. And I don't know if that's single or multiple dose. It's 156 million doses. So that probably is not necessarily counting all the people who have gotten double doses, but it's a significant number. And so we're starting to see an impact. The problem in the United States right now is that vaccination rates are much higher in some parts of the country than in other parts of the country. And that's creating a situation like what we feared would happen globally, that the high-income countries would vaccinate, the low-income countries would be unvaccinated, and that divide will cause the pandemic to continue. And in the United States, there are big swaths of the country that have much lower vaccination rates. And ultimately, that could undermine the success of the other parts of the United States in terms of achieving relatively high vaccination rates at this point. So, I mean, as much as possible, this has to be a group effort. We got into this together, we're gonna leave it together. And, as with everything else, in Korea, right? I mean, masking and distancing isn't gonna work unless everyone's working together. Vaccination is the same, and everyone has to be vaccinated. You can't count on your neighbor being vaccinated to protect you.
Would you say that we're on schedule with the pace of the vaccination, or are we kind of like there's just a lot of real world problems that we have to deal with?
So I think, yes, you're right. There are real world problems, and one of the issues is supply. It's prove it, make it, use it, and we're having problems making enough vaccine. But this is the case whenever new technology is brought online. You're not going to be able to get enough of something in the beginning. I mean, look at iPhones. I mean, try to get an iPhone the day that it's offered. Whereas if you go 3 months later, you don't have to stand in line. And the same is true now for vaccines. Not to say that vaccines and iPhones are the same, but in this case, we're talking about manufacturing 16 billion doses of vaccine. And by comparison, a vaccine that has global use, like the flu vaccine, is made at between 400 and 500 million doses a year, not 16 billion doses a year. And that's going to be a real challenge because now a significantly greater amount of vaccine will make its way into the pipeline. And any delays could result in vaccine having to be destroyed. And so I think people remember that in Malawi burned 20,000 doses of AstraZeneca vaccine because of the expiration date.
That was actually going to be my next question because a lot of these vaccines have expiration dates. And how long do they last and why do they expire?
Typically, you get to a period of maybe 12 months or 24 months before the vaccines need to be considered outdated and destroyed. But that would be under normal circumstances where we have years to develop a vaccine. In this case, the vaccines were developed in 11 months. So we don't always have the ability to say that batches made on, in September of 2020, we know that they'd be good for 3 months. And then after, by March, we know that they'll be good through March and probably into June. And so the company's extending the use-by date continuously. For instance, some of the RNA manufacturers like Pfizer actually don't put an expiration date. There's a code there that you enter into your phone, and it'll give you the latest information on when the expiration date is. Now, that's not typical. This is something that's very unusual. Vaccine manufacturers usually are very careful about when vaccines expire. But because vaccine supply is so limiting, they don't want any doses to be wasted if they don't need to be wasted. And so they've come up with innovations like this. The US had 60 million doses of AstraZeneca vaccine already available, and that vaccine is being extended. It's really important for the companies to keep up with this because they know. They've seen the demand forecasts for these vaccines. They know how many countries want them, and for a vaccine to be wasted is really unconscionable.
But then again, I suppose the other side of the argument is that if it's expired and then you take the shot and it doesn't have any protection, then...
Right, and so that's the reason why, we have to make sure that the systems exist so that, when we know what the final expiration dates will be on batches that are produced now, and maybe they'll be 24 months, that's fine. We can put the expiration date on. Right now, when the vaccines themselves are only, we have approved vaccines since December, to be tossing away doses when, still 7.5 billion people may still need additional vaccine is really kind of difficult to justify. We're certainly not out of the woods, and the pandemics that are going on now in South Asia, an unknown epidemic that's going on in Africa, a continuation of the pandemic, the outbreaks that were going on in South America, and also now, most recently, the outbreaks in South and Southeast Asia, they continue. And until those parts of the world will be able to vaccinate more of their population, we not only stand the risk of additional hospitalizations and deaths, but the emergence of additional mutants. And I think that's one of the greatest concerns because we spent $1 billion in 12 months to try to develop these vaccines. $20 billion in 12 months to develop the vaccines that we have.
That's crazy, yeah.
And if we allow the mutants to undermine all the progress that we've made, then we're back to square one. Not entirely back. I think the good news is maybe the vaccines continue to protect to some extent, but when they function less well, we'd be in uncharted waters.
So let's talk about that, all the variants and mutants. Have they proven to have any adverse impact on the people that have been currently vaccinated?
Right now, for the mutants we know, it appears that the vaccines continue to protect.
Okay.
And so, I think in the past, people were used to the results from phase 3 trials, where we're evaluating vaccine against placebo in 30,000 or 40,000 people. What we're getting now is actually effectiveness data, so real world evidence. So what they'll do is, the United States will vaccinate nearly 50% of its population, or the UK will be above 50%, or Israel will be at 63% of their population. And then you look at and see where the infections are occurring. And as you would expect, in some of those countries, the vaccines are running into mutants or variant viruses, variants of concern, the WHO term. And so far, it looks like the vaccines are efficacious. So there's data from the United Kingdom that both the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine and the AstraZeneca vaccine protect against the circulating mutants. And they looked at the Indian variant and also the variant that's circulating in the UK called B117. So efficacy or effectiveness in the range of 85 to 90%, which is still pretty good in terms of reducing severe disease hospitalizations and death. Unfortunately, the news cycle is traveling ahead of the science cycle. And so, we're always trying to figure out what the meaning of the latest mutant is, or what the meaning of the latest data from Brazil are, or Chile. Again, suggesting that data from those countries is suggesting that in fact the vaccine continues to protect even against the circulating mutants. So that's the good news. Will it continue to protect if we can't, as a global population, control the outbreaks? Perhaps not, because we know that these uncontrolled outbreaks are generating new mutants all the time. And some of them haven't spread. Some of them have started to spread and we're beginning to sequence them. But we really need better information in order to ensure that these vaccines continue to work as they should.
You talked about India. Why are things so bad over there? Why is the virus mutating in that way?
As long as there are unvaccinated people or people who are naive, haven't been exposed to the virus before, there are people who are going to get infected. And it only takes an introduction, the wrong type of introduction of a virus into an otherwise naive community for there to be an outbreak. A lot of it is complacency. You know, India had, as with many countries, thought it turned the corner. It had a big problem. The numbers went down. They were feeling pretty comfortable. The problem is that, you know, you have to be on your guard. You have to always be vigilant around COVID-19, and I think we've been taught that lesson over and over again. As soon as you stop surveillance, as soon as you stop using masks and distancing, when you stop testing, you run into problems with the virus appearing, and before you know it, it's not an outbreak with 500 people. It's an outbreak with 5,000 or 50,000 people. And it doesn't take long for one of those outbreaks to go out of control. And in India, again, they thought they had turned the corner on it, the worst of it. They were talking about exporting vaccine, but we enter into a season when lots of people were gathering for different kinds of reasons, and the virus was spreading. And before you knew it, the system was overwhelmed. And the importance of India for the manufacture of global health vaccines, the impact of the pandemic or the most recent outbreak in India has been very profound.
So what kind of impact would that have on the world, the rest of the world, if India does this poorly, either from the supply side or the mutant or the variants traveling to different countries?
It's, as you said, the generation of new mutants from uncontrolled outbreaks. And right now we're very concerned about, they call it the India double mutant. It's actually got more than 2 mutations in it.
Wow.
It's called B1617 or B.1.617, the scientific designation. It's the one that we know about, but right now, today or yesterday or a week ago, other variants of concern could have been arising, and we just don't know how significant a problem they'll create until they're much more widespread.
So that particular variant, are they worse than the original virus, or?
We believe that they can spread more readily. It's not clear yet whether they are more deadly. So the I'm going to call it 117 because it's easier than putting all the periods in there, but B117, which is the UK variant, not only spread more rapidly, but appears to be associated with a higher, it appears to be more deadly. It's not clear whether the Indian variant will also be. But the fact that it spreads more readily means that, a person who gets it has the potential to give it to more people more efficiently. The other part of this is that it appears to have mutations that may make it less sensitive to the protective responses generated by vaccines. So remember that vaccines generate a certain level of what we call neutralizing antibody.
Yep.
And the Indian viruses in particular are less sensitive to neutralization. The good news is, though, that in the effectiveness trials that have been done so far, they appear to be, that the AstraZeneca and Pfizer-BioNTech vaccines appear to work against it. Still with effectiveness between 85 and 90%, which is good.
That's good.
Will we be so lucky the next time? Don't know. And I think that's why we really have to do everything that we can to help India control this problem. Now, we focused on India. South Asia has a lot of countries with populations over 100 million.
Right.
And a number of these countries are reporting large outbreaks, and the viruses from those outbreaks are less well characterized.
Once people actually had COVID, so they were already infected with COVID, so they probably have some sort of virus in the system, do they still need to get vaccinated?
Yes, so that's a great question. And the other question that's related to it is when. So if you've had COVID, you should probably wait until symptoms have resolved, and many people say 3 weeks, but it can be longer before you're vaccinated.
Right.
What we know is that if you've had COVID and get one of the vaccines, you develop really, really high levels of neutralizing antibody,
That's
that
interesting.
protein that binds to and inactivates viruses. We also found that antibody appears to be able to cross-neutralize some of the variants of concern.
Wow.
And so it is a good idea to vaccinate everybody, regardless of whether or not they've seen the virus before, have been infected before, and that those people who are naturally infected, who receive booster doses, appear to be able to respond very well. And actually, you can think about it the same way you do about influenza. Now, I've had influenza probably almost certainly once, maybe twice that I can remember. I've never felt sicker before. I always get my influenza vaccine now, and the recommendation is to continue to get it every year, at least in the United States. Other countries have different risk groups that they vaccinate, but it works the same way. That prior infection is not a contraindication. Actually, governments continue to encourage people to be vaccinated.
I think if you tell them that simple piece of information that it's like some super booster, then people will want to get vaccinated, even because right now the sentiment is like, oh, what's the point? I already have the neutralizing antibody, and then like I don't need the vaccines.
Yeah, actually, there's a somewhat cautionary tale here because, and we don't really know because, unfortunately, the data weren't. We didn't have enough information from the studies that were done. But there's a town in Brazil called Manaus, and they had achieved what they believed to be herd immunity, herd protection, with 70% of the population infected during the first wave of the pandemic.
Okay.
During the second wave in Brazil, their emergency rooms were packed. People were dying.
Despite the fact that they thought they achieved herd immunity.
Right. And actually, and they've actually, and Sinovac was used in that population as well, and was shown to be effective in that population, in the protection of healthcare workers in particular, who are at very high risk. So again, vaccination is important even if you've been infected, and I hope that most people who have been infected naturally with COVID will also agree that further protection, particularly against mutants, is worth it.
Just double checking, but obviously you have been vaccinated.
Yes.
And did you experience any side effects?
So I did have a headache, but I have headaches frequently anyway. I think just it comes with.
And it comes with the nature of your job.
Yeah, and I'm sure you do too. But nothing out of the ordinary. I don't even think. I guess my arm did hurt for a day, but other than that, and the occasional headache, which happens anyway, and which I treated with ibuprofen, which is again sort of a mild painkiller. My daughter's got, one daughter got Moderna, one daughter got Pfizer, and my wife got Johnson & Johnson, so same vaccine that I did, and side effects were very minimal.
So what's the deal with this AstraZeneca blood clot thing? And then like did you guys anticipate any medical complications in relation to blood clots or?
No, not with regard to blood clots. In fact, they didn't really appear in the phase 3 trials. Now remember, the phase 3 trials involved tens of thousands of people, like 30,000 people in one trial, and in another trial in the US, again, with similar kind of numbers. I mean, huge numbers of people. It turns out that these blood clots occur maybe 1 in 100,000.
So 1 in 100,000, okay.
Or with Johnson & Johnson, between 1 in 100,000 and 1 in 500,000. And to put it into perspective, your risk of dying in the United States from a lightning strike is about 1 in 138,000, which is in the same ballpark. Right. Now, that being said, do I try to go out? Do I try to avoid going outside if there's lightning and rain? Yes, I do. So I think it's a reasonable concern. It's something that we should be aware of. And if we can look at the risk of the side effect versus the risk of getting very sick from COVID, and it depends on each country and the setting of the pandemic in each country. So we don't really know why it happens. We know how it happens, and it happens because there's something about the way there are certain kinds of illnesses that happen in the care of patients, where we were giving people blood thinners called heparin. And people develop these antibodies against heparin. So they develop a response against the medication. And that causes platelets to clump. So your blood has not only red cells and white blood cells that fight infection, but it has blood clotting cells called platelets. And when you have certain kinds of heparin antibodies, they cause these platelets to clump. And for some reason, the adenovirus-like vaccines, which actually contain no heparin, cause a similar type of antibody to appear in the blood. And we're not sure exactly why. And it appears to be more common in women, and in younger women in particular. Now, that being said, it also happens with COVID. COVID infection by itself, in the absence of vaccination, causes these same kinds of blood clotting problems. So as we look through, do an analysis of what is actually causing this, is it something involved in the manufacture of adenovirus-based vaccines? Is it something that has to do with products that come when the vaccine is being purified? Or is it something, is it a person who's been vaccinated and then gets exposed to COVID? And is it a response to COVID itself? Again, difficult to know. And I think, a lot of additional work is going to be necessary to understand the basis for this phenomenon. It doesn't appear to happen commonly with the mRNA vaccines. One of the, two big scientific advances during COVID has been the proof of concept of mRNA vaccines, so Moderna, Pfizer-BioNTech, and now another vaccine in its phase 3 of testing called from CureVac, a German company. And that's been a really remarkable thing because we'd never had an approved mRNA vaccine before. The second would be the adenoviral vectors. And I say vectors because AstraZeneca is made from an adenovirus that actually is specific to chimpanzees. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine is specific for a adenovirus type 26. The CanSino vaccine is adenovirus type 5. The Gamaleya Sputnik 5 vaccine is actually Ad26 and Ad5. So you get one dose of one and then a second dose of the other one.
Just for context, what's adenovirus vaccine? I mean, you just kill the virus and then that becomes a vaccine?
No. So you take the adenovirus and you genetically modify it to express, in the case of COVID, a piece of that outer spike protein of COVID. If you remember the image of COVID, it has all these little spikes on the outside. Well, that little spike is what the genetic information for that spike is inserted into the adenovirus.
Right.
Now, adenovirus as a part of its life cycle will bind to human cells, will enter them, and that little piece of genetic information that contains a spike protein will be expressed and made into protein, and that protein then directs an immune response or generates an immune response that typically binds to and neutralizes the virus, and that's what we want. The first set of adenovirus-based vaccines were authorized for Ebola, which I think most people would recognize as a disease which is terribly lethal, with mortality rates in excess of 50%. The Ebola virus vaccines, and so there's one from Johnson & Johnson, which is based on an adenovirus called adenovirus type 26, and there's one from CanSino, which is based on adenovirus type 5. And the adenovirus type 5 vaccine didn't go through full testing, but the adenovirus type 26 is actually approved. So a number of vaccines are shown to be safe and efficacious, all based on adenovirus. And adenovirus vectors are important because you can generate new vaccines very quickly. So remember that AstraZeneca was up there with, and also Sputnik 5, the Russian vaccine, reported results around the same time as Pfizer. So you can generate vaccines very quickly using recombinant DNA technology and adenoviral vectors. What we don't know about adenovirus vectors has to do primarily with whether you can receive additional doses of the same vaccine. Because one of the reasons adenovirus vectors work so well is that your body is used to dealing with adenovirus. It's a common pathogen. And so when your body sees adenovirus type 5, it has often a memory response. It says, I've seen adenovirus type 5 before, I know what this is, and it mounts a very strong response against the adenovirus. As you give more and more doses of the adenovirus vaccine, the immune system starts to say it's the adenovirus, not the spike protein that's in it. Oh. And so you may start losing the response to the COVID-19 part.
So you can't trick your immune system anymore.
Right. So that's why the Sputnik 5 vaccine uses Ad5 and Ad26, because you give the spike protein with Ad5 once and you give it with Ad26 the second time, you're not getting the immune response recognizing only Ad5 or only Ad26. It may be that Ad26 is safer to give or is good to give more times, but again, this is information that's still evolving. We've tested adenovirus vectors in thousands of people for HIV largely, and also now for Ebola.
Yeah, so I think it's just a bit of a shame that they just get a bad rap, especially the AstraZeneca, because of all the publicity and the media play, and then now people are like, I don't want to take AstraZeneca because it's adenovirus vaccine, right?
I think also people are looking at simple efficacy and saying, well, you know, this vaccine was 60%,
Right.
Or 76% in the United States, or 60% in the original trial, versus 95%. But, you know, the effectiveness of the vaccine in terms of reducing severe infection, hospitalization, and death tend to be in the above 80% anyway, which is what you want.
Right.
So I can tell you, so my daughters, apparently among the young, Pfizer's considered the best vaccine. And it's what do they call it? The bougie vaccine, whatever bougie means, bourgeois vaccine. And then the middle class vaccine is Moderna. And then AstraZeneca and the others are for other people.
Right.
And I don't know where this
where do they come from?
where this classification comes from, because it's not correct. I mean, really what we're interested in is effectiveness. And effectiveness is, these vaccines are effective at the 80% or greater level. We know that, for instance, the Pfizer vaccine and the AstraZeneca vaccine are effective against mutant viruses, including the UK variant and the current Indian variant. So these are all important additional information that inform countries' decisions to move ahead with vaccination. So I don't know where they got that from. I guess it must be circulating on the internet, but it's absolutely not the case. These vaccines are safe and efficacious. They all have high effectiveness, and that means that yes, you can get a Johnson & Johnson vaccine or a Pfizer vaccine and still become infected. But this isn't something that's, this kind of infection isn't the one that's going to put you in the hospital or put you on a ventilator or potentially kill you. So, and that as a country or as a person is what you want.
We actually have this specific question from one of our subscribers who asked this question, because you just said that for young women in particular, or younger people below the age of 30, they don't recommend taking AstraZeneca vaccine. Or let's talk about any vaccines. Can young women who are on birth control pills, do you think that there's going to be any complicating factors for them to take the COVID vaccine?
So around the vaccines that are associated with blood clots, I would guess that that's one of those decisions that their physicians are probably going to recommend that they not. And many of them wouldn't pass the age criteria anyway, either 30 or 40. For the other vaccines, we think that for instance, the Pfizer, Moderna vaccines are okay. And at some point, Novavax, the Novavax vaccine hopefully will be approved also, which is a protein-based vaccine. And that one should also be fine for use in women and women on birth control. For the other vaccines, so elsewhere in the world, where the Chinese vaccines, Sinovac or Sinopharm, or CanSino, again, Ad5, but the Sinopharm and Sinovac vaccines are whole inactivated vaccines. So they're probably fine for, again, use in women who are on birth control. For use in pregnancy, that's going to be a much more difficult question, because typically when you're doing a phase 3 trial, you don't include pregnant women.
Interesting.
And you advise people not to become pregnant during the time when they're participating in the trial.
Why is that?
Vaccines are given to healthy people to keep them healthy. So one of the things that we often exclude, one of the exclusion criteria for participating in a trial is, are you anticipating becoming pregnant in the next 12 months, or the duration of time for the trial? Because we don't want to have to answer the question, the secondary question, will the vaccine affect pregnancy or pregnancy outcomes? We don't want the vaccine to be the cause of a bad outcome in any regard. And so we advise, so in trials, we don't include pregnant women.
What's your take on the latest CDC guideline from the US that people can start taking their masks off?
If they're vaccinated. The problem here is you don't wear a big red V on your forehead when you get vaccinated. And given the problems with compliance with mask mandates in the past, and the politicization of the wearing of masks, reverting to an honor system could be premature. And it really is an honor system, right? Because you wouldn't know that I'm vaccinated. I could even show you a card, and apparently in the US now, people are forging those cards. It's a card issued by the US government that says you've received, actually I have one.
Oh, okay.
That actually says you've been vaccinated. Sure.
Wow, okay.
And you can, unfortunately, order them.
You can force them.
Yeah, and so I think at some point they're going to need some other way to verify that these are real, and that they correspond to actual receipt of a vaccine.
Even after people get vaccinated, do you still recommend that people continue to wear masks and socially distance, regardless of what the CDC guideline says?
I think that you have to be careful. Part of the reason we're wearing masks, probably the more important reason, is to protect others from us.
Yes.
So, there is data that masks do prevent infection. The better scientific data is that masks prevent transmission. So I would wear a mask to protect others from me in case, as a vaccinated person, I may not get really sick, but I could still transmit the virus. Now, there are emerging data, and this is good news, that being vaccinated decreases the amount of virus that you carry if you get infected.
Right.
So you may be less infectious in a sense, and that's a good thing, right? Another benefit of vaccination is not only A, preventing infection, but maybe B, preventing transmission, and then C, preventing disease. So there are multiple reasons to get vaccinated in the way that you can protect others, in the same way that the mask protects others. So the US CDC has its guideline. I think that countries will have to examine their own situations with regard to the pandemic and the number of cases as they assess. The US CDC made that recommendation in the setting of decreasing rates of infection in the US.
Right.
They're still not anywhere near what the level in Korea is.
Do you think that move was a bit premature?
I think if you could count on people,
Can you?
And again, I think that the CDC made its judgment based on what it thought states in the U.S. could achieve. And in a sense, this incentivizes vaccination, as long as it's not misinterpreted.
I think that's a very optimistic way of looking at it. Hope that people don't misinterpret when they probably do.
And I also hope that if we go to visit the United States in the summer, as I think we plan to, we'll be wearing masks. And I think the important thing, and the director of CDC said this is no reason to discriminate against people who are wearing masks, because they're wearing masks not to protect themselves only, but to protect others. And it's a sign that you care.
Why is Korea so slow in that regard? Because remember, if you remember the initial response, Korea was super fast. And now, people just have no idea when am I getting my shots?
As the Korean government brings in vaccine, and I think the first large shipments of vaccine are expected in June, the Korean government, if it vaccinates 70% of people by November or sooner, will be doing as well as any country in the world. When can we go out and eat? When can we visit with family and have parties of more than 4 people? As more and more people are vaccinated, those things will loosen up. When can we go running without a mask on?
Probably not this year, right?
I think the anticipation is in the summer, as more and more people are vaccinated, some of the outdoor activities may become more acceptable.
In Korea?
In Korea, yeah. Widespread travel, there still aren't uniform guidelines around countries accepting other countries' vaccination certificate.
Yes.
Or even, for instance, if you go to the United States and get vaccinated and come back to Korea, you're still going to be quarantined.
Right.
So there are lots of things that have to change, and I think countries are wise to watch the data, and then to begin the process of talking about arrangements that will cross-recognize vaccination certificates and allow travel. This is something where governments have to work with each other in order to develop a standard that they both will recognize.
What's your take on the people encouraging companies to waiver their patent for vaccines? Because there's a bit of an argument about that, right?
Yeah, and so, IVI, so far for our vaccines that have been tech transferred to companies, oral collar vaccine, typhoid conjugate vaccine, we don't have a patent. But this gets to the second part, which is what we transfer, and the reason, you don't have people coming up and copying oral collar vaccine or others, is that what you're really transferring is the know-how to manufacture the vaccine, and that's different.
Right. So it's companies' IP, basically.
Yeah, it's not something that is released in the patent statement. So even if Pfizer decides not to pursue something, you won't be able to effectively duplicate the 50,000 steps that BioNTech puts into its vaccine unless they teach you how to do it. I mean, you could come up with it on your own, but it could take months or maybe a year or more. And that's not really going to help us in the short term. I mean, if the goal is to really get increased production short term, then we have to look and see where the bottlenecks are.
Right.
If the bottlenecks are in what we call fill and finish, that is, companies have large quantities of vaccine that just can't be put in vials fast enough, then maybe the deals that need to be made are increasing the number of organizations around the world that do fill and finish. The other part of this is, transferring the ability to manufacture the vaccine. So Korean companies, Indian companies, Brazilian companies, actually an Indonesian company, are manufacturing vaccines under contract with the original manufacturers. So Chinese companies, AstraZeneca and Novavax for SK Biosciences, AstraZeneca for Serum Institute of India in India. So you can transfer the ability to manufacture a vaccine, and to the extent that that's possible to a company that has made vaccine before and has known quality is really important. Because again, it may be difficult for a company that's never manufactured a vaccine before in a country where the regulatory authority doesn't have the necessary qualifications to be able to supervise the quality of manufacture.
Right.
That could result in substandard vaccine, maybe not dangerous, but not effective. And so this is something where, yes, we should have thought about planning this before the pandemic. In the middle of the pandemic, when we need 8 billion doses by the end of the year, it's probably not the time to be wasting time, with discussions on patents, when what we really need to do is just ramp up production as quickly as we can. And really, it's been kind of remarkable. Merck, which is maybe the number 2 or number 3 largest vaccine manufacturer by revenue in the world, is manufacturing a vaccine from Johnson & Johnson, which actually has a much smaller number of vaccines that it sells and revenue that it makes. Sanofi, which is one of the the great vaccine manufacturing companies, is making vaccine not only for Johnson & Johnson, but for Pfizer. Actually, a vaccine from a small German biotech, BioNTech. I mean, we'd never seen this before. Right. But it's a remarkable thing that the companies recognize that they can actually fill a gap and manufacture a high-quality vaccine that can be used everywhere. And that's the goal. I mean, in the next 3 to 6 months, we really need as much vaccine as possible. So IVI supports this idea. We need to negotiate it. We need to figure out how to make it work because there are lots of moving pieces, and not all the high-income countries have signed on to that.
Just talking about the patent aspect, it's a bit simplistic, and it's not really looking at the whole picture, basically.
I mean, in the long run, it would be important for this to be an open discussion. I mean, in fact, I think I saw that Moderna's CEO said, for the duration of the pandemic, we're not going to pursue these patent issues. And that's important. The bigger question is, what happens afterwards? I mean, and the scary part is, if you're a small company like BioNTech, which introduced really groundbreaking technology and brought it to bear very quickly onto a problem that, the world was confronting. What BioNTech has in particular, besides the RNA, is the little wrapping that it puts on the RNA, which is a little fatty wrapping that gets put on the RNA. That's the same fatty wrapping that they'll use for their cancer vaccines and their other vaccines. And if you force them to give that away, will they ever want to participate in any pandemic activity in the future.
Yeah.
So are you actually discouraging small innovative
Like
companies?
startups, yeah.
Yeah, and when you look at who really contributed during the pandemic, right? You have BioNTech and now partnered with Pfizer. You have Moderna, which didn't have a licensed vaccine. You have Novavax, no licensed vaccine. AstraZeneca, which stopped making vaccines a while ago and didn't make vaccines until it brought on Oxford, which is like a small biotech. So the companies that made a difference here were biotechs. And the last thing you want is to discourage them from participating the next time, because we are willing to give away something that is critical for their value as a company or as a small company.
I think that's pretty good update, but is there any other new findings that you kind of want to share with our viewers that people might not be familiar with?
Countries around the world have introduced a number of different vaccines, right? So there have been 10 that have been shown to be safe and efficacious. Yeah. The big question that's coming up now is what happens when we mix and match vaccines? So if we have to get a booster, when do we have to get it? And what booster will it be? And it was kind of funny. So I think a couple of the CEOs of the vaccine companies have been saying, yeah, it looks like maybe at 6 months or so, we'll definitely need a booster. And I think Dr. Fauci said it's not going to be up to them when we introduce the booster. So, and it's absolutely true. At 6 months, it looks like the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines still have a reasonably high level of protective immune response remaining. Does that apply to all the vaccines? Possibly not. So it's going to be important to keep an eye on the vaccines, particularly those that didn't generate really high levels of protective immune response initially. Because as the level of protective antibody begins to drop off, it's going to be necessary to boost. So we're starting to see studies where people are reporting what happens if you start with a Pfizer vaccine and boost with an AstraZeneca vaccine. In all likelihood, it'll be shown to be safe. It'll probably be shown to increase the level of protection because that's based on data from other vaccines, not necessarily on COVID-19. I think the other part of this will be, is there anything else in the future that will be better? And the second generation of vaccines is well on its way. A number of vaccines are in phase 3 now, or will be entering phase 3 early in the summer. And so we might be able to get readouts on those before the end of the year. And a number of them are these protein vaccines. So a bit harder to make, a bit slower, but also these are vaccines that can be made in significant quantity at a reasonable price and can be partnered with what we call adjuvants. And adjuvants are things that boost immune responses, and they're mixed with these protein vaccines in order to make them better. And it looks like some of them generate fairly high levels of protection. The gold standard, I think, for this right now is the Novavax vaccine, which is not yet approved. But again, these are hopeful developments for the future. The next thing is also now vaccines against the mutants. So now some of the companies, including, the RNA companies probably foremost, are trying to develop vaccines that are matched to some of the mutants. And the big questions now are, can we just use a single vaccine? Can we use just the vaccine against the mutant? Will it protect against the old versions? Which would be great. Or can we give it as a booster to something that's already been given, and does it still protect? And I think the answer to both of those, well, to the second question, maybe yes. To the first question, we're still waiting to see.
Any last words you want to share with our subscribers?
No, I think, we're at a new phase in the pandemic. And at least for IVI, our most important concern is not only vaccination in Korea, but actually making sure that vaccine is distributed equitably. Because the ongoing pandemics that are uncharacterized in South Asia and Africa really pose a threat to all of us. The Office of National Intelligence in the US has basically said the same thing that everyone else has been saying in making a very simple statement that until we control and until we can distribute vaccine equitably and bring the pandemic under control everywhere, the United States is not safe. No one's safe. And I think that's a lesson that we have found it difficult to get a hold of. And so I think it's going to fall to countries to fully support the organization called COVAX, which is distributing vaccine around the world, to allow vaccine to enter COVAX, to ensure that, it's not going to be the case that 88% of the vaccine used in the very beginning of the pandemic is used by only the high-income countries. While there are, if you look at the map of where vaccination is occurring, there are many places on the map that are blank. And we can't allow that to happen if we want to be rid of this globally.
We'll definitely have a chat with you at some point in the future.
Hopefully when everyone's vaccinated and we can have the next one at a restaurant somewhere.
Something like that. Have a drink.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you so much.
Great to see you.